Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
It started like any other lazy afternoon with my sister Stacy. The two of us were sprawled out on my couch, binge-watching reruns of Modern Family. Stacy was practically doubled over with laughter at one of Cam's over-the-top moments. Her perfectly manicured hand clutching her soda can like it was a lifeline. For a moment, it felt like we were kids again before life got complicated. Then, out of nowhere, she asked, "Can I ask you something serious?" The sudden shift in her tone caught me off guard. Stacy wasn't exactly known for her serious conversations, so I muted the TV and turned to face her. "Of course," I said, smiling. "What's up?" She fidgeted, her hands twisting together in her lap. "I've been meaning to bring this up for a while," she said, her voice uncharacteristically timid. And then, like a boulder crashing through a window, she blurted it out. "Will you be my surrogate?" The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I blinked at her, trying to process what she'd just said. We'd grown up together, shared everything from clothes to secrets, but this was on a level I hadn't seen coming. "Stacy," I started, choosing my words carefully. "You know I love you, but I can't. I've never wanted kids, and I just can't." Her expression darkened instantly. Gone was the nervousness, replaced by a sharp glare. "You can't? Or you won't," she snapped. "This is a small thing to ask. You're my sister. How could you say no?" The shift in her tone put me on the defensive. "It's not about you," I said, my voice firm but calm. "It's about me. I've never wanted to go through pregnancy. That hasn't changed, and it's not going to." "What about donating your eggs?" she shot back. "Would you at least do that?" "Of course," I said quickly. "You can have as many as you need. I'd be happy to help you that way." But instead of easing her anger, my offer seemed to fuel it. She stood up, her face red with frustration. "You're so selfish," she spat. "I can't believe you're doing this to me." She grabbed her purse and stormed out, leaving the door wide open behind her. That night, my phone lit up with a barrage of texts. At first, I ignored them, hoping she'd cool off and see reason. But the pings kept coming, relentless and insistent. When I finally checked my phone, I found message after message filled with guilt trips and emotional manipulation. Stacy had sent photos of her childhood diaries, where she'd written about her dreams of becoming a mom, along with snapshots of vision boards she'd made as a teenager. "I've been planning this my whole life," one text read. "You're ruining my only chance to have a family." Another message said, "If you were a real sister, you'd do this for me." My stomach twisted as I scrolled through her words. I'd always known Stacy could be intense when she wanted something, but this was different. This was personal, and it cut deep. I didn't respond. What could I say? The guilt weighed heavy on me, but I couldn't give in, not to this. I'd spent my whole life trying to set boundaries with Stacy, and this was the biggest one yet. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Little did I know, that conversation on the couch was only the beginning. Over the next few weeks, Stacy's desperation, and her husband Jeff's involvement, would take a dark and dangerous turn. And the simple act of saying no would unravel my life in ways I never could have imagined. The weeks that followed Stacy's explosive departure from my house were nothing short of a nightmare. She wasn't just angry. She was relentless. Every few days, she'd send a message or leave a voicemail that alternated between sobbing pleas and venomous insults. The first time she called me a traitor to our family, I actually laughed out loud in disbelief. But as the tirade went on, her words started to sink in. I'd never been on such bad terms with her before. We were twins, two sides of the same coin. We'd fought over petty things growing up, like who got the better half of a shared dessert or whose turn it was to borrow our dad's old car. But this was different. The anger she directed at me felt like a living thing, feeding on our shared history and weaponizing it against me. Mike, ever the steady presence in my life, tried to help me see the bigger picture. "She's hurting," he said one evening as I scrolled through yet another angry text from Stacy. "That doesn't make what she's doing okay, but maybe she just needs time." "She's my twin, Mike," I said, setting my phone down with a heavy sigh. "I can't just cut her off, but she's asking me to do something I'm not capable of. How do I even begin to explain that to her in a way she'll accept?" "You've already explained it," he said gently. "The problem is, she doesn't want to hear it." Despite the tension, I still hoped for some kind of reconciliation. When Dad invited us over for one of his famous football nights, a family tradition since we were kids, I thought it might be the perfect chance to clear the air. I imagined Stacy and me sitting on the couch, laughing over chips and dip while Mike and Jeff debated stats from the game. Maybe we could find common ground again, just like old times. But the moment Stacy and Jeff walked through the door, I knew my hopes were misplaced. Stacy's smile was brittle, her eyes red as if she'd been crying. Jeff, on the other hand, looked like he was ready for a fight. He didn't even bother saying hello. "Nice to see you too," I said dryly, trying to keep things light. Jeff ignored me, but Stacy shot me a glare that could have melted steel. They barely interacted with anyone during the first half of the game, sitting stiffly on the far side of the room. Every time I glanced their way, I caught Jeff whispering furiously to Stacy, his jaw tight with anger. The eruption came during halftime. Dad had stepped out to grab more snacks, and the rest of us were lounging around the living room when Jeff finally broke his silence. "You're unbelievable," he said, his voice cutting through the chatter like a knife. I blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," he snapped, rising to his feet. "You're a selfish bitch. You could fix all of this for Stacy, but instead, you're sitting there acting like a victim." Mike was on his feet in an instant. "Watch your mouth," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Jeff turned on him, his face red with fury. "You have no idea what this means to her," he shouted, pointing at me like I was the villain in some melodrama. "You're ruining her life? And for what? Because you're scared? Pathetic." I stood frozen, the weight of his words pressing down on me. Stacy, who had been silent up until now, burst into tears. "Please," she sobbed, clutching at my arm. "Please just say yes. I'll never ask for anything else, I swear. I need this. And you're the only one who can help me." The desperation in her voice cracked something inside me, but it wasn't enough to sway me. "I'm sorry," I said quietly, pulling away from her. "I can't do this." The shouting only grew louder. Mike and Jeff were nose to nose, trading heated words while Stacy wailed in the background. Dad finally returned, his arms full of snacks, and immediately stepped between them. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded. Jeff pointed an accusing finger at me. "Your daughter's selfishness is tearing this family apart." "Enough," Dad said firmly, his voice brooking no argument. He turned to Jeff, his expression hard. "You don't come into my house and disrespect my family. If you can't control yourself, you need to leave." Jeff stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Stacy hesitated, her tear-streaked face twisted in anguish. "You don't understand," she said, looking at me like I was the enemy. "You're the only one who can fix this." Then she followed Jeff out, leaving the rest of us in stunned silence. That night, I couldn't sleep. Stacy's words replayed in my head, each one cutting deeper than the last. She'd made it clear that she saw me as the obstacle standing between her and the life she wanted. But it was Jeff's behavior that haunted me most. His anger felt too intense, too personal. The next morning, I woke up to another series of texts from Stacy. Her messages alternated between pleading and accusatory, each one more frantic than the last. But what truly unnerved me was Jeff's growing involvement. At first, he'd stayed in the background, letting Stacy do the talking. But now, his presence loomed over everything, his influence twisting her words and actions into something darker. I started to wonder if this was even about Stacy's dream of motherhood anymore, or if it was about Jeff's obsession with controlling the situation and ensuring the baby had our DNA. The cracks in our relationship were deepening, and I could feel everything I'd ever known about my sister crumbling under the weight of it. Little did I know, those cracks were about to shatter into a million pieces. A week after the chaotic football night at my dad's house, I pulled into his driveway to find my car vandalized. My stomach dropped as I approached the vehicle, the glint of shattered glass from the passenger window catching the late afternoon sun. Both front tires were flat, and taped to the windshield was a note, written in jagged, scrawled letters. "You'll regret this." I stood frozen, my heart pounding. Who would do this? The obvious answer loomed in my mind, but I couldn't bring myself to say it aloud. After calling Mike and Dad to let them know what happened, I texted Stacy. "Hey, weird question. Do you think Jeff knows anything about this? Someone vandalized my car at Dad's." Her reply never came. Hours passed, and the silence was deafening. That night, I lay awake replaying the scene in my head. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, maybe just some random act of vandalism. But deep down, I knew better. Over the next few days, I started noticing things, small, unsettling things that were easy to dismiss at first. A car parked on my street late at night, headlights off, engine idling just long enough to make me uneasy. A figure I'd catch out of the corner of my eye while walking to the grocery store, disappearing when I turned to look. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Paranoia, I told myself, fueled by the stress of the situation with Stacy and Jeff. But the incidents became more frequent and harder to ignore. One evening, as I walked out of my favorite coffee shop, I saw a car parked across the street that looked suspiciously like Jeff's. The windows were tinted, and the license plate was partially obscured by dirt, but I could feel someone watching me from inside. I hurried to my car, my coffee forgotten, and drove straight to Mike's apartment. "Are you sure it was him?" Mike asked after I recounted the incident. "No," I admitted, gripping my mug of tea tightly. "But it feels like him." Mike placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "We'll figure this out. Just stay with me for a while. I don't like the idea of you being alone." The situation escalated a few days later. Mike and I had gone out for dinner, hoping for a distraction from the growing tension. As we left the restaurant, I noticed a familiar car in the parking lot. It was Jeff's, unmistakable with its distinctive dent on the rear bumper. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just a coincidence. But as we drove home, the car appeared in my rearview mirror, trailing us at a careful distance. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I whispered to Mike, "I think we're being followed." When we pulled into my driveway, the car stopped a few houses down. Jeff stepped out, his posture tense, his face shadowed in the dim streetlight. "This has gone too far," he said, his voice low and menacing as he approached. "You need to do this for Stacy, for the family. You don't get to just say no." Mike got out of the car immediately, stepping between us. "Back off," he said firmly. Jeff's gaze flicked to Mike, but his focus quickly returned to me. "You think you can run from this?" he sneered. "You're not going anywhere until we fix this." My breath hitched as I fumbled with my phone, dialing 911. "I'm calling the police," I said, my voice shaking. At the sound of the operator's voice, Jeff's expression shifted. He took a step back, his hands raised in mock surrender. "Fine," he said, "but this isn't over." He got into his car and sped off before the police arrived. The officers who responded took my report seriously, but their hands were tied without hard evidence. "It's his word against yours right now," one of them said, clearly frustrated. "If you can get any documentation, photos, texts, anything, it would help." I nodded numbly, feeling the weight of the situation settling over me like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just family drama anymore. It was something darker, something dangerous. Mike insisted I stay with him indefinitely, and I reluctantly agreed. The idea of going back to my apartment alone was unbearable. But even with his unwavering support, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow felt threatening, every sound in the night like a prelude to disaster. I didn't know how to stop Jeff, and the fear of what he might do next consumed me. The man who had once been my sister's charming college sweetheart was now a stranger, a predator lurking in the shadows, determined to get what he wanted at any cost. And I had no idea how far he was willing to go. I thought I had mastered the art of avoidance. I changed my routines, picked obscure routes to and from work, and even started using the staff-only back exit at the airport terminal to avoid crossing paths with Jeff. Every precaution I took felt like adding another layer of protection, but it also felt like I was building a cage around myself. So when my friend Danielle invited me to brunch to celebrate her upcoming wedding, I hesitated. The thought of being out in public made my stomach churn, but Mike encouraged me to go. "You can't let him take your life away," he said gently, squeezing my hand. "I'll drop you off and pick you up. Just go have fun." For the first hour I did. The sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the restaurant, and the mimosas flowed freely. We laughed, gossiped, and for a brief moment, I felt like my old self again. Then the waiter approached our table. "Excuse me," she said, her face lined with concern. "Your husband is up front. He says it's an emergency." My blood ran cold. I wasn't married, and I knew exactly who was waiting for me. I excused myself under the pretense of needing to make a quick call, but as I approached the restaurant's front entrance, my worst fears were confirmed. Jeff was standing just outside the door, his hair disheveled and his shirt wrinkled, as if he'd been up all night. He saw me and immediately plastered on a forced, almost mocking smile. "What are you doing here?" I hissed, keeping my voice low as I stepped outside. "I just want to apologize," he said, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. "Can we talk? Please?" Everything about his demeanor felt wrong. Too controlled, too calculated. But I didn't want to create a scene in front of the brunch crowd. Against my better judgment, I nodded and followed him a few steps away from the door. Once we were out of earshot, his smile dropped like a mask. "You don't understand what this means to us," he said, his voice low and hard. "You have to help Stacy. This isn't about you." "Jeff," I began, my voice steady despite the panic rising in my chest. "I've told you before, I'm not doing this. And following me like this? It's harassment." His jaw clenched, and he took a step closer, invading my space. "You're being selfish," he snapped. "Do you even care about your sister? Do you have any idea how much this is hurting her?" "Of course I care," I shot back. "But that doesn't give you the right to—" He cut me off with a growl, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "You think you can just walk away from this? You're going to regret it." He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my skin. Before I could react, a man walking past noticed the commotion and intervened. "Hey, is everything okay here?" the man asked, stepping between us. Jeff immediately released me and threw his hands up in mock surrender. "We're fine," he said, his tone suddenly light and friendly. "Just a family disagreement." The man wasn't buying it. "It doesn't look fine to me," he said firmly. "Why don't you step away from her?" Jeff glared at him for a moment before backing off. "Whatever," he muttered. "I just wanted to talk." He stormed off to his car, leaving me trembling on the sidewalk. After the stranger made sure I was okay, I returned to the table, my appetite completely gone. I mumbled an excuse about feeling unwell and called Mike to pick me up. That evening, I filed another report with the police, but their response was as frustrating as ever. "Unless he's made a direct threat or violated a restraining order, there's not much we can do," the officer said apologetically. I felt the walls closing in. Jeff was escalating, and each encounter left me more shaken than the last. Every time I closed my eyes, I replayed his words. "You're going to regret this." I tried reaching out to Stacy again, desperate for her support, or at least an acknowledgement that she understood what her husband was doing. But her silence spoke volumes. She wasn't ready or willing to face the reality of Jeff's actions. I wasn't just being stalked. I was being hunted. And with every passing day, it became clearer that Jeff wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted, or until I found a way to stop him. I'll never forget the moment I stepped into my apartment that day. The usually quiet space, my sanctuary, felt violated in the most profound way. My front door was ajar, the lock hanging loosely from the frame as if it had been pried open. My heart raced as I cautiously pushed the door wider, taking in the destruction. The living room was unrecognizable. The couch cushions had been slashed, their stuffing spilling out like entrails. My books were torn from their shelves, pages ripped and scattered across the floor. My desk, where I often spent hours writing, was overturned, my laptop lying a few feet away with its screen shattered. The kitchen was no better. Every cabinet door hung open, their contents strewn haphazardly across the counters and floor. The mugs I'd carefully collected over the years were shattered, shards of ceramic crunching underfoot as I stepped inside. But it was the bathroom that stopped me in my tracks. Scrawled across the mirror in what looked like lipstick were the words, "It'll only get worse." I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short, panic gasps. Fumbling for my phone, I called 911, barely able to string together a coherent sentence as I explained what had happened. The police arrived within minutes, their presence both a relief and a grim reminder of how serious the situation had become. They moved through the apartment methodically, taking photos, dusting for fingerprints, and cataloging the damage. "Do you have any idea who might have done this?" one of the officers asked, his expression professional but tinged with concern. "Jeff," I said without hesitation. "My brother-in-law. He's been stalking me for weeks." The officer nodded, jotting down notes. "Do you have any texts, emails, or other communications that might link him to this?" I showed them the messages I'd received from unknown numbers, but as always, their response was frustratingly measured. Without definitive proof that Jeff was behind the break-in, their ability to act was limited. That night, I packed a bag and went straight to Mike's apartment. I didn't even bother trying to clean up the mess or replace the broken lock. The thought of staying there, of sleeping in that space after what had happened, was unbearable. Mike was waiting for me when I arrived, his face a mixture of anger and worry as I recounted the day's events. "That bastard," he muttered under his breath. "I should have done more when he confronted you at brunch." "This isn't your fault," I said, though my voice wavered with exhaustion. I don't know what to do anymore." He pulled me into his arms, his embrace steadying me even as my nerves threatened to unravel. "We'll get through this," he said, his voice firm. "You're safe here. I promise." But I didn't feel safe. Not really. The paranoia followed me everywhere. Cars parked too long outside Mike's building made my skin crawl. Every shadow felt like it was watching me, every unexpected sound like the prelude to another attack. Even the buzz of my phone sent a jolt of fear through me, as if each message might contain another threat. 3 days later, Stacy called. I almost didn't pick up. Our last few interactions had left me raw, but something in the pit of my stomach told me to answer. Her voice, shaky and tearful, poured through the receiver. "I didn't know," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I swear, I didn't know he was doing all of this. I just found out." I sank onto the edge of Mike's couch, my chest tightening. "What are you talking about?" "I've been following him," she admitted. "I had this feeling. After the fight at Dad's, I started noticing things. He'd leave the house late at night. He'd make calls from the car, and he wouldn't tell me who he was talking to. I started tracking him. My pulse quickened. And he's been stalking you," she said, her voice breaking. "I saw him park outside your apartment. I saw him follow you to that coffee shop. I didn't realize it was this bad until now. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or angry." Her confession was a step toward the truth, but it didn't undo the damage. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked, my voice trembling with emotion. "I was scared," she whispered. "Scared of what he might do to you. Scared of what it would mean for me if I admitted what he's become. I went to the police today. They're sending someone to talk to you." Her words hit me like a wave. After weeks of feeling isolated and helpless, Stacy was finally acknowledging what Jeff had done and what he was capable of. "I'm filing for divorce," she added, her voice thick with tears. "He's not the man I thought he was. I need to get away from him." For the first time in what felt like forever, I exhaled. Stacy's confession was a turning point, but it wasn't the end of the nightmare. Jeff wasn't the kind of man to give up easily, and the road ahead still felt uncertain and dangerous. As I hung up the phone, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. Hope that, together, we might be able to stop him. Hope that this nightmare might finally come to an end. But, deep down, I knew better than to believe it would be that simple. Jeff was still out there, and he wasn't finished yet. Hearing Stacy's voice crack as she apologized broke something in me. For weeks, I'd been carrying anger like a shield, trying to convince myself that her betrayal had severed our bond completely. But in that moment, it was impossible to ignore the pain in her voice, the weight of everything she'd been through, everything she'd let herself believe. "I'm so sorry," she repeated, her words heavy with guilt. "I should have seen the signs. He's been controlling me for years, but I was too scared to admit it. When I found out what he'd been doing to you, I knew I had to do something." Her confession was both a relief and a heartbreak. Stacy wasn't innocent in all this. She'd made choices that put me in harm's way. But it was clear that Jeff had manipulated her just as he was trying to manipulate me. "I started following him after the restaurant," she admitted. "When he grabbed your hair, it finally clicked how far he was willing to go. I needed to know what he was doing when he wasn't home. I needed proof, not just for you, but for me too." Her voice trembled as she recounted what she'd seen. Jeff parking outside my apartment late at night, driving aimlessly for hours, and making calls from burner phones. "I didn't want to believe it at first," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But then I saw him go into your building. That's when I knew." I felt a surge of gratitude toward our dad, who'd apparently convinced her to come clean. "He told me I didn't have a choice," she said. "He said if I didn't step up, I'd lose you forever. And he's right. I can't let that happen." The next morning, the police arrived at Mike's apartment to take my updated statement. 2 officers sat with me in the living room, their presence both comforting and nerve-wracking as I recounted everything that had happened. The vandalism, the stalking, the break-in, and the encounter at brunch. "We have enough to start surveillance," one of them said after taking notes. "Between your statement and Stacy's, we're confident Jeff will make another move soon. When he does, we'll be ready." Their plan was simple. Have an unmarked car follow me while I went about my day, waiting for Jeff to show up. "Stay calm," the officer advised. "If you notice someone following you, don't react. Just go about your routine. We'll handle it." Mike and I decided to treat it like a normal day. We grabbed coffee at our favorite cafe, strolled through the park, and even stopped for lunch at a trendy new restaurant downtown. But no matter how hard I tried to relax, the tension was palpable. My eyes darted to every car we passed, every face in the crowd, half expecting Jeff to appear at any moment. It didn't take long. As we pulled into the parking lot of a bookstore, I spotted Jeff's car a few rows back. My heart raced as I whispered to Mike, "He's here." The officers had been tailing us from a distance, and within moments, they were in position. I watched from the passenger seat as they approached Jeff's car, their badges out. He tried to argue, but there was nowhere for him to go. Minutes later, he was in handcuffs. Watching him get arrested felt surreal. I'd imagined this moment 100 times, but I never expected it to feel so quiet. There was no dramatic showdown, no fiery exchange of words. Just the cold, efficient motions of justice taking its course. For the first time in weeks, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Jeff was finally out of my life, at least for now. That night, Mike and I celebrated with margaritas, laughing for the first time in what felt like forever. "You're going to have to teach me your tolerance," he joked as I nursed my second drink. "Because you're putting me to shame." The levity was short-lived, though. The next morning, I got a call from the detective handling Jeff's case. "We've searched his phone," she said. "It looks like he's been using multiple texting apps to send those threatening messages. Combined with the other evidence, we have enough to pursue harassment and stalking charges." It was progress, but not a guarantee. The detective explained that while they had enough to hold him for now, there was always a chance he'd make bail. "If that happens, we'll notify you immediately," she assured me. "And we'll recommend a restraining order as part of the conditions of his release." The thought of Jeff walking free sent a shiver down my spine, but I tried to focus on the positives. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't fighting this battle alone. Stacy, too, was taking steps to rebuild. She'd moved in with our dad temporarily and had started divorce proceedings. "I don't care how hard he fights it," she told me over the phone. "I'm done letting him control me." Hearing the resolve in her voice gave me hope. Hope that, together, we might finally put this nightmare behind us. But deep down, I knew better than to let my guard down completely. Jeff was a man who thrived on control, and I had a sinking feeling he wasn't finished with us yet. When Stacy moved into my apartment, it felt like the beginning of an uneasy truce. We had so much history, good, bad, and complicated, that sharing a space again was both comforting and strange. The circumstances were surreal. My twin sister, once firmly aligned with her husband's increasingly erratic demands, now seeking refuge from the same man who had turned our lives into chaos. The first few days were tense. Conversations felt stilted, like we were both tiptoeing around the obvious. We exchanged pleasantries about the weather and reruns of the Great British Bake Off, but there was a heavy silence hanging between us, filled with all the things we hadn't yet said. It wasn't until the third night, when we were curled up on the couch with mugs of tea, that Stacy finally broke down. "I thought I needed him," she said, staring in her cup as if it held all the answers. "I thought he was the only one who understood me, the only one who really cared. But now," she trailed off, her voice trembling. I waited, giving her the space to continue. "But now I see how wrong I was," she finished, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "He didn't love me. He loved controlling me. And I let him. I let him isolate me from everyone who actually cared about me. Even you." I didn't know how to respond at first. How could I sum up the tangled mess of anger, betrayal, and lingering affection I felt for her? In the end, I just listened. Stacy talked for hours that night, peeling back the layers of her marriage like she was reliving it in real time. She told me how Jeff had started subtly undermining her confidence early on, questioning her decisions, and making her feel like she couldn't function without him. Over time, he'd cut her off from friends, dismissed her ideas of getting a job or pursuing hobbies, and made her believe her sole purpose was to be his wife and the mother of his children. "I thought if I could just give him a child, everything would be okay," she admitted. "That's why I was so desperate. I wasn't just doing it for me. I thought it would fix everything. But it only made things worse." Hearing her admit these things was both painful and illuminating. It helped me understand why she had pushed so hard for me to be her surrogate, why she'd been willing to overlook Jeff's behavior until it reached a breaking point. It didn't excuse what she'd done, but it gave me context I hadn't had before. As the days turned into weeks, Stacy and I began to mend the fractures in our relationship. It wasn't easy. She carried a lot of guilt, not just for Jeff's actions, but for the way she'd treated me. "You were right to say no," she said one night, her voice barely audible over the soft hum of the TV. "I should have listened to you. I let him push me into something I wasn't ready for, and I hurt you in the process. I don't know if you'll ever forgive me, but I'm sorry." Her words caught me off guard. For so long, I'd been bracing myself for another fight, another attempt to justify her actions. But this was genuine remorse. "I do forgive you," I said, my voice cracking. I need time to let everything settle." It was a rare moment of vulnerability, and it reminded me of the sister I'd grown up with, the one who used to sneak me snacks during study sessions and braid my hair before school dances, the one I'd loved unconditionally, even when we didn't see eye to eye. In the weeks that followed, Stacy began rebuilding her life. She filed for divorce from Jeff, a move that sent shockwaves through his carefully curated facade. He fought her at every turn, but Stacy stood firm, bolstered by our dad's support and the therapist she'd started seeing. She moved into a small apartment closer to Dad's house, a modest but cozy space that felt like a fresh start. She even started looking into jobs, something Jeff had always discouraged. "I want to be independent," she told me one day. "For the first time in my life, I want to stand on my own 2 feet." Our relationship wasn't perfect, but it was healing. We spent more time together than we had in years, going for walks, binge-watching our favorite shows, and even brainstorming ideas for the book I'd been working on. For the first time in a long time, it felt like I had my sister back. But the scars Jeff had left, on both of us, weren't easy to ignore. Every time I walked past my broken front door or glanced at the messages he'd sent, I was reminded of how close we'd come to losing everything. "Do you think he'll stop?" I asked Stacy one night as we sat in my apartment, the weight of the question hanging between us. Her face clouded with uncertainty. "I don't know," she admitted. "But if he doesn't, we'll deal with it together." Her words were a comfort, but I couldn't shake the nagging fear that Jeff wasn't finished with us yet. As much as I wanted to believe we'd turned a corner, I knew the fight wasn't over. Jeff thrived on control, and the one thing he couldn't stand was losing it. That made him dangerous. And while we were starting to rebuild the pieces he'd tried to break, I couldn't ignore the shadows lurking just beyond the edges of our newfound peace. For now, though, I clung to the small victories. Stacy was free from Jeff's grasp, and for the first time in years, we were rebuilding bridges instead of burning them. Whatever came next, we would face it together. For a brief moment, it felt like life was finally settling down. Stacy had moved into her own apartment, a cozy little place near our dad's house, and seemed determined to build a fresh start. Mike and I were finding our rhythm as an engaged couple, planning our future with a mix of cautious optimism and genuine excitement. For the first time in months, there were glimmers of normalcy. But the shadows of Jeff's obsession lingered. It started subtly at first. Unfamiliar phone calls from numbers I didn't recognize, always hanging up the moment I answered. Then came the texts, anonymous, cryptic, and chilling. At first, they were vague warnings like, "You'll regret this," or "We're not done." I tried to dismiss them as pranks or even misdirected messages, but deep down, I knew better. As the weeks passed, the messages became more sinister. Promises of retribution, vile threats, and disturbing implications of what Jeff planned to do if I didn't give him what he wanted. It felt like he was everywhere and nowhere at the same time, his presence a suffocating weight on my chest. I reported every message to the police, who assured me they were investigating. But without definitive proof that Jeff was behind them, their hands were tied. The detective handling the case was sympathetic but realistic. "He's being careful," she said during one of our calls. "We'll keep monitoring him, but he's not leaving much for us to act on." Knowing Jeff was likely watching me was a constant source of dread. Every errand, every outing, every moment outside the safety of Mike's apartment felt like stepping into a trap. My paranoia seeped into everything I did, and I hated how much control Jeff still had over my life. One evening, after a rare night out with Mike, I noticed a car parked across the street from the apartment. Its headlights were off, but the outline of a person in the driver's seat was unmistakable. "Do you see that?" I whispered, gripping Mike's arm as we approached the door. He followed my gaze, his expression hardening. "Stay here," he said, pulling out his phone to call the police. I stood frozen on the porch, my heart pounding as I watched the car. It felt like hours, though it was only minutes before the engine roared to life and the car sped off into the night. The police arrived shortly after, taking a report and promising to patrol the area. But the encounter left me rattled. Even Mike's reassurances couldn't shake the feeling that Jeff was still out there, waiting for his next move. The next escalation came just days later. I arrived home from a quick trip to the store to find a package sitting on my doorstep. At first glance, it seemed innocuous. Plain brown paper, no return address, but the handwriting on the label struck a nerve. It was eerily familiar, and my stomach dropped as I realized where I'd seen it before. On the notes Jeff had written to Stacy during their marriage. I stared at the package for a moment, my hands trembling. Against my better judgment, I opened it. Inside was a single item, a tiny pair of baby shoes. I dropped the package as if it were on fire, a wave of nausea washing over me. The message was clear: Jeff hadn't moved on, and he wasn't giving up. Mike came home minutes later to find me sitting on the floor, tears streaming down my face as I stared at the shoes. He immediately called the police, but by the time they arrived, the damage was already done. The officers took the package as evidence, but their reassurances felt hollow. "We'll do everything we can," one of them said, his tone kind but firm. But without catching him in the act, it's hard to build a solid case. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the apartment, every shadow cast by the streetlights outside, felt like a threat. I kept replaying the moment I opened the package, imagining Jeff's twisted satisfaction at my reaction. I also couldn't stop thinking about Stacy. Despite everything we'd been through, she was still my sister, and the thought of Jeff dragging her back into his madness filled me with dread. I called her the next morning, relieved when she picked up on the first ring. "I'm okay," she said, her voice steady but tired. "I've been staying with Dad a lot lately, just in case. You should come over." I wanted to believe that being with family would make things better, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Jeff wasn't done with us yet. Every step forward felt like walking deeper into a nightmare, and I didn't know how much more I could take. The baby shoes were just the beginning. Jeff's message was loud and clear. He wasn't going to let go. The morning after finding the baby shoes, I called Stacy. I needed to warn her, to make sure she was safe. To my relief, she answered on the first ring. "Hey," she said, her voice calm but tinged with the same weariness I felt in my bones. "Are you okay?" "Not really," I admitted, recounting the package and its chilling contents. "I don't know what's worse, what was inside or the fact that he knows where I live." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Stacy finally spoke. "I've been getting strange texts too," she admitted. "But I blocked the numbers. I didn't want to worry you." "Stacy, this is serious," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "Blocking numbers won't stop him. He's escalating. You need to stay with Dad for a while, just to be safe." She hesitated, the silence stretching uncomfortably long. Stacy hated feeling like a burden, and I could hear the internal debate in her voice when she finally said, "Okay, I'll go, just for a few days." "You're not a burden," I said, softening my tone. "We're in this together. You're not alone." While Stacy moved in with Dad, the police were finally making progress. The texts from Jeff's phone, combined with the evidence Stacy had collected, were enough to charge him with harassment. He was arrested again, and for a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to hope this might be the end of it. But that hope was short-lived. A call from the detective handling the case shattered any illusion of safety. "We have him in custody," she said, her voice steady but grave. "But there's something else. During the investigation, we found evidence suggesting he's been working with someone, possibly a relative or close friend. They've been helping him track you." My stomach dropped. The idea of Jeff having an accomplice was something I hadn't considered, and the thought made my skin crawl. "Do you know who it is?" I asked, gripping the phone tightly. "Not yet," the detective admitted, "but we're looking into it. In the meantime, I'd suggest taking extra precautions." I called Stacy immediately to share the news. "He is help," I said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Someone's been working with him, helping him track us." Her sharp intake of breath was audible over the line. "Who could it be?" "I don't know," I said, frustration and fear knotting in my chest. "A relative? A friend? Someone from his past?" "I can't think of anyone," Stacy said, her voice shaking. "But if he has help, you need to be careful." "We both do." From that moment on, I shifted into full survival mode. Mike and I installed additional security cameras around the apartment, upgraded the locks, and even set up motion-activated lights in the hallways. I stopped going anywhere alone, coordinating with Mike or Stacy whenever I needed to leave the house. My job as a flight attendant, which had once been a source of independence and adventure, was now on indefinite hold. The idea of traveling while Jeff, or whoever was working with him, was still out there felt impossible. I also began looking into legal options to ensure Jeff couldn't come near me again. A restraining order was already in place, but I wanted something stronger, something permanent. "He's not going to stop unless we stop him," I told Mike one night as we reviewed our next steps. He nodded, his hand resting protectively over mine. "We'll find a way. Together." Despite all the precautions, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I left the apartment, I scanned the area, my eyes darting to parked cars and shadowed corners. Every unfamiliar face felt like a potential threat. One evening, as Mike and I returned from a quick trip to the grocery store, I spotted a car idling at the end of the block. Its headlights were off, but the faint glow of a cigarette illuminated a figure inside. "Do you see that?" I whispered, gripping Mike's arm. He nodded, his jaw tightening. "Stay inside. I'll handle this." Mike grabbed his phone to call the police, but by the time they arrived, the car was gone, leaving only a faint smell of smoke in its wake. The breaking point came a few days later when another package arrived at the apartment. This time, there was no handwriting to recognize, just a plain box left on the doormat. My heart sank as I picked it up, dread pooling in my stomach. Inside was a single item, a framed photo of Stacy and me from childhood, The glass cracked, and the words "soon" scrawled across the back. I dropped the frame, the sound of shattering glass echoing in the hallway. Mike was by my side in an instant, his arms wrapping around me as I trembled. "We'll get him," he whispered, his voice a mix of anger and determination. "Whatever it takes, we'll make sure this ends." The police took the package as evidence, but the message was clear. Jeff, or whoever was helping him, wasn't finished. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the walls closing in. Jeff's reach was broader than I'd imagined, and the realization chilled me to the core. Whoever his accomplice was, they were still out there, and they were closing in. The storm that Thursday evening mirrored the chaos brewing beneath the surface. Sheets of rain battered the windows as thunder rumbled in the distance. Mike and I had just returned from a tense meeting with our lawyer, finalizing documents to ensure Jeff couldn't find any loopholes to continue his harassment. I was exhausted emotionally and physically, and all I wanted was a quiet night. That peace was shattered when the power went out. The apartment was plunged into darkness, save for the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the room. At first, I thought it was the storm. An electrical outage was common during bad weather, but the timing felt too convenient. My stomach twisted as my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "We're not done yet." A wave of panic surged through me as I realized what this meant. The cameras were offline, the security system disabled. Jeff, or someone working with him, had found a way to cut the power. "Mike," I called out, my voice shaking. He was already grabbing a flashlight, his expression grim as he checked the front door. "It's locked," he said, turning to me. "Stay here. I'm going to look around. Don't go outside," I begged, grabbing his arm. "Please." But before he could respond, a loud crash came from the backyard. My heart felt like it stopped. Mike handed me the flashlight and grabbed a kitchen knife, motioning for me to stay put. "Call the police," he said, his voice low but commanding. My hands trembled as I dialed 911, trying to explain the situation to the operator. "There's someone in our backyard," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "The power's out, and I think it's my brother-in-law." "Stay on the line," the operator said. "Officers are on their way." The minutes felt like hours as I waited, clutching the flashlight like it was a lifeline. Mike disappeared into the backyard, his silhouette briefly illuminated by the flickering flashlight in his hand. I wanted to run after him, but fear kept me rooted in place. The sound of shouting broke through the rain, followed by the unmistakable wail of police sirens. I ran to the window, just in time to see two figures being forced to the ground by officers. Even in the dim light, I recognized Jeff. But he wasn't alone. The second man was his brother, someone I'd only met a handful of times at family gatherings. It all clicked in an instant. This was the accomplice the police had suspected. Together, they planned to break into the house, cutting the power to disable the cameras and security system. When the police entered the apartment to speak with me, they confirmed my worst fears. Both Jeff and his brother had been found carrying tools to break in, as well as what appeared to be restraints. Their intent was clear, and this time, there was no question about the severity of their actions. The arrest marked the beginning of the end. With Jeff and his brother in custody, the DA promised to pursue the harshest charges possible, including attempted burglary, harassment, and conspiracy. They were denied bail, and the restraining order against them was expanded to include Stacy and my father. When I called Stacy to tell her what had happened, she broke down in tears. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice raw with emotion. "I should have seen how dangerous he was. I should have done more to protect you." "You don't have to apologize," I said, my voice softer than I expected. "We both got caught in his web, but it's over now." She didn't respond right away, but I could hear her steadying her breathing. "Thank you," she said finally, "for standing up to him when I couldn't." In the weeks that followed, life slowly began to return to normal. Stacy finalized her divorce, and I returned to work. Mike and I focused on planning our wedding, using the process as a way to reclaim some joy after months of fear and uncertainty. The scars Jeff left behind didn't disappear overnight. I still double-checked locks before going to bed, and every unknown number on my phone sent a jolt of anxiety through me. But there was a new strength in me, a resilience I hadn't known I possessed. One evening, as I sat on the couch flipping through wedding magazines, Stacy joined me, a cup of tea in her hands. "You know," she said, her tone lighter than it had been in months, "I think I might apply for that job Dad mentioned at the library. It's time I do something for myself." I smiled, feeling a warmth that had been absent for far too long. "You'd be amazing at that," I said. Despite everything Jeff had tried to do, he hadn't broken us. If anything, his actions had made our bond stronger. Stacy and I had fought our way back to each other, and we were finally ready to move forward. As I looked at my sister sitting beside me, I realized we'd won. Not just against Jeff, but against the fear and darkness he'd tried to bring into our lives. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't afraid. I was free.